Welcome to Overcaffeinated and Out of Effs, the podcast for burned out, career-minded moms who are ready to stop pretending everything's fine and feel like themselves again. I'm your host, Christy Amir, burnout coach for moms, licensed therapist, and mom of two. And I'm here to help you reclaim your energy, your identity, and your peace of mind. Whether you're lying awake thinking about the 87 things you didn't get done, or silently resenting the people you love most, this is your space to feel seen, supported, and not so alone. So grab your coffee, hot, cold, or day old, and let's get into it. Hey everybody, it's Christy. Welcome to Overcaffeinated and Out of Effs. In today's episode, I'd like to welcome our guest, Dr. Tara Cousineau. Dr. Tara is an author, clinical psychologist, meditation teacher, and coach with over 20 years of experience helping high achievers unlock their potential with ease and confidence. Dr. Tara specializes in guiding individuals and organizations to cultivate inner worth, self-compassion, and authentic leadership. She's also a part-time staff psychologist at Harvard University's Counseling and Mental Health Services and brings expertise in mindfulness, mind-body medicine, and innovative psychological approaches. Dr. Tara is the author of a new book, The Perfectionist Dilemma: Learn the Art of Self-Compassion and Become a Happy Achiever. She'll help listeners discover how to embrace self-compassion without compromising high standards, cultivate inner leadership, and transform perfectionism into a path toward greater ease, balance, and joy. So in today's conversation, we are going to focus on perfectionism. So this is something that many working moms struggle with. And actually, I was talking to Dr. Tara just before our interview started, and she mentioned that it comes up in so many of these episodes, which is true because it is just something that is so common with so many of these moms who are out there. And so I have invited her here today so that we can really talk about that specifically, why people struggle with perfectionism, the mistakes they make when they're trying to overcome perfectionism, and how to break free of it. So, Dr. Tara, thank you so much for being here today.
And I'm happy to be here, Christy.
Do you mind maybe starting off by just telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this work?
Well, I'm probably an overcaffeinated mom. And I've been there. I think where a lot of your listeners might have been. I mean, my daughters are now in their 20s, so I've sort of survived a lot of the parenting piece of it. And as a career mom, I always worked. I never not worked. But perfectionism in and of itself is something that I would say that I was conditioned to be a perfectionist in my family of origin. And then I knew that sort of my survival strategy, essentially, in my particular household was to get an education. And so I just really directed all of my attention towards achievement and success. And it worked for a while until it stopped working. And then I began my private practice and, doing talks, and perfectionism just kept coming up over and over again. And granted, I live in sort of a little nook in the country where there are 60 colleges and universities around. I'm in the Boston area. There are a lot of high achievers. There are a lot of startups here. There's a lot of biotech. And so people are pretty high achieving. Like, you can't really walk down the neighborhood without having, knowing that, oh, that person's definitely a high achiever. So it comes up and people struggle. And what happens is, and this is a topic that you talk about a lot, is that eventually they burn out.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just decided to tackle the topic head on.
Okay, well, great. Well, again, I'm so excited that you're here today because I feel like this is such an important topic, especially for the listeners here. So before we, really get into it, I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little bit about, what exactly is perfectionism? I think a lot of people throw the term around and they have an idea of like maybe what it means to them. But from your understanding and perspective, how would you describe it?
Yeah, a lot of people consider perfectionism like a, humble brag or something like that, when actually it's really not. But I've come to my own definition, and it incorporates some of the research-based definition, but it really is sort of what I've come to understand. And so I define perfectionism as a paradox created by a need for belonging and a fear of rejection paired with these unrealistic expectations for achievement and approval that
Uh-huh.
basically sap your energy and life force. So that's the
Mhm.
part that I added on. As a clinician, I'm like, okay, we can define it as striving for unrealistic or high ideals, but it is actually something that drains you of your energy. And
Mhm.
often a perfectionist or a self identified perfectionist, or even someone that's just struggling with sort of the not good enough gremlins, um, they end up in my office because they have a chronic health condition.
Mhm.
Migraines, IBS, insomnia, some kind of chronic pain. And it's like, well, how did you get here? And then you hear the story and you're like, oh, okay, your battery has decided that it's quits,
Mhm. Mhm.
you know? So,
So basically what you were describing is exactly what I feel like all these burned out working moms are coming with. I feel like that is, in a nutshell, just why so many of us are having such a hard time. And so, as you know, the people who are listening to this podcast are primarily, burned out working moms. And so, a lot of them are high achieving moms. And so I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts about why high achieving moms in particular struggle with perfectionism and this pressure to perform?
well, I think anyone who's pursuing some kind of career has achievement in mind, I
Mhm.
mean, versus, oh, I'd like to have a job and have this quality of life and, actually have a more healthy approach.
Mhm.
But people, want to achieve. It's part of their identity. It's been part of their identity for a really long time. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with striving for excellence. What happens is it becomes this sort of, I call it more of a mind body pattern than sort of a cognitive pattern because on some level, we know, those of us who identify with perfectionism to some degree, that it's not always healthy. And it shows up in certain ways, like irritation with a partner, or frustrations with colleagues at work, or just having your own private meltdown in your car.
Mhm.
It shows up in those kinds of ways. So, why I mean, you almost can't have perfectionism without sort of that compulsive striving associated with
Mhm.
it
Mhm.
in some way. Like, you don't really see a relaxed perfectionist. That would
Mhm.
probably be more of sort of a healthy striver.
Mhm. Okay. So again, for people who are perfectionists, it's beyond that line, right? Beyond, being a healthy striver to the point where it is really, having more of this negative
It's
effect on them.
Yeah, there's a sort of contracted energy, tension builds. Um, it does affect interpersonal relationships a lot of the time. It's interesting, when I was writing the book, I was kind of seeing, well, what's the updated research on this? And there's a researcher in Canada that talks about, Patrick Gaudreau, he talks about the point of diminishing returns. So he kind of identifies sort of the healthier version of striving as excellencism, and
Mhm.
then there's perfectionism, and and he uses this economic metaphor, this point of diminishing returns is that you can strive, and kind of be climbing that hill. And at some point, um, the extra effort that perfectionists
Mhm.
put in doesn't net out any benefit. In fact, it wears you out, you start to make mistakes, and that's the point of diminishing returns. And so you don't want to get to that sort of that point. You wanna actually stop yourself before that, that's where that sort of classic, 80/20 rule is helpful, is that when you're striving, stop at 80%. You need the energy, you need the stamina to actually, persist, but if you are sort of burning the battery at both ends, most likely, your perfectionism is gonna kind of come back at you in a way that you hadn't anticipated.
Well, and I'm wondering because, a minute ago you were talking about, what it looks like when we have reached that point already. But for people who are trying to prevent getting to that point, like what would be some signs that they would look for? Like, how would they know, sort of determine where that line is when they are about to cross, the point of diminishing return, as you were talking about?
Well, this is where self-awareness is just really key.
Hmm.
And sometimes people don't have that awareness, but maybe a spouse or a friend or a parent might just say, "Hey, listen, honey, this seems a little extreme." But for the most part, people know it. And Um, but because they have this sort of pattern, which is a survival pattern, the brain is really gonna kinda do what it's familiar with, and it's gonna keep on going. So you actually have to once you have that point of awareness, you need to actually do something different.
Mhm.
You need to do something that's more beneficial or healthier, even if there's that part of you that says, "No, keep on going, keep on going." And I think that is practice, essentially.
Okay. Okay. Absolutely. Well, and I like how you were talking about too, this degree of awareness, right? And a lot of times people already sort of know it, right? And for the people who maybe aren't as aware of it, just being open to that feedback from the other people in our lives, because a lot of times they can see things that we can't see, and just being open to that perspective.
Right. So the opposite of perfectionism is really having this sort of awareness and flexibility, right?
Hmm.
So sometimes people could identify as like, oh, no, I can get really kind of, stuck in my ways or I can be inflexible. Well, that could be a cue. It's interesting. I'll go back to some of the research because this is kind of interesting. So the number crunchers out there have been studying perfectionism over the last 30, 35 years. And basically, what they found is that there's been this sort of upward trend of perfectionism. It hasn't diminished. I actually feel like that there's an inflection point right now, like perfectionism is having its day. Like people are talking about it, books are being written about it. But the researchers are actually also Canadians. I love the Canadians, actually. They're great researchers. Have identified like three buckets or types of perfectionists. And one is the self oriented perfectionist. That's the person who sets the bar really high for themselves, striving to achieve. They're really self motivated. They're just kind of on that straight path forward. Then there's the other oriented perfectionist. That's the perfectionist that has expectations that people around them do things perfectly.
Hmm.
And I feel like that's the stereotype in the movies, like, The Devil Wears Prada, the Miranda, like, you have to do everything absolutely pristine. And those are difficult people often, and sometimes I will actually get, people will be my private practice and they've been called into HR and they're shocked. They're like, wait a
Hmm.
minute, this is important for me. If it wasn't for me, this company wouldn't be running. And it's like, whoa. The feedback is that you're really difficult to work with and blah, blah, blah. Let's get curious about it. But there's a third type of perfectionism that I think that moms need to be self-aware, but also aware for their kids, and that is socially prescribed perfectionism,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's the kind of perfectionism I call it the compare and despair perfectionism, and that is we're basically when you're always kind of the bar is not your own bar, it's like what society or culture or social media says is the right thing to do or the perfect way to be, all of that, and, we're fed that 24/7. I mean, it's just terrible, like, that just keeps getting worse rather than
Yeah,
better. And
absolutely.
so that's the type of perfectionism that's associated with more mental health problems, more distress. And so we actually kind of do need to monitor how exposed, we are as moms. I mean, when I think back to when I was a young mom, we didn't have social media, but we had Martha Stewart Living. We had the books like, What to Expect When You're Expecting and Having the Perfect Pregnancy. We got it in other ways socially, but now you're getting that information just every second of the day. So that's just something to kind of be mindful of is that there might be perfectionism and it's not really in these other areas, but it's really about comparing yourself to other people.
Okay. Yeah. And comparison. Yeah, it's something that I think so many people can identify with and relate to. And to your point with social media, it's just it's happening all the time. So I appreciate you, bringing up that point. So another thing that I know you've talked about before is just this idea that perfectionism often comes from, this desire to feel accepted, safe, and worthy. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that and really where that comes from, especially for women, especially for these working moms.
Yeah, well, it's really sort of multiple factors, I would say. There is a little bit of heritability with perfectionism. So, like I said, like I had a mother, she's still alive, she's German. Like we couldn't leave the house unless it was spotless, So
Mhm.
sometimes it's just kind of in your DNA. It's good to be mindful and aware of it. There's the social and economic piece of it where women are expected, and this also hasn't changed over the decades, to have it all, to be the perfect mom, to be the career woman, to have the house neat and tidy. And that's just kind of we're just marinating in that stew. It's like you live in it, you don't even know that there could be another possibility, essentially. So there's that piece of it. Then there's, I think, just even in our friendship groups and, reinforced, there was about 10 years ago, I was a global advisor to the Dove Self-Esteem Fund. And that was really interesting because the research that they were doing was showing that even in our little day-to-day interactions, we'll say to a friend, "Oh, hey, Christy, you look great today. I love that outfit." Or, "Hey, Christy, you're looking great. Did you lose some weight?" Like, which is so unconscious that our sort of even first interaction with other people is about appearance. Right? We
Mhm.
absorb that versus saying, let's say, "Oh, hey, Christy, it is so good to see you. I'm so happy to be with you today." Like
Mhm.
and we have to kind of just notice how we do this really subtly.
Yeah.
And it is kind of a practice. So I think, this is all a practice, starts with self-awareness and trying to kind of shift, you know, getting away from that piece about how you present yourself, to other people or how you sort of, I don't know, just talk to other people.
Well, and I would also imagine too, you're talking about, how we talk to other people and how we might subtly be, communicating these messages. But I'm also thinking about, those who are on the receiving end of it, right? And so, what sort of um, mindset things do they need to be paying attention to? What are some ways that they can sort of protect themselves from absorbing those messages when they notice that they are getting them from another person?
Yeah, so I think that when people start to practice self-awareness, and you can do that in so many different ways, but really kind of pausing and being present and just recognizing when you're getting that hit or that trigger and responding in a different way.
Mhm.
So I'm gonna go back to the self-awareness, but with the perfectionism, going back to the question you had before about how it's associated with this need for belonging and this fear of
Mhm.
rejection. I mean, ultimately, when I sit with someone who self-identifies as a perfectionist, um, it's so much about a part of them that feels that if they aren't striving, that they will be critiqued, judged, punished in some way, that not being good enough is unacceptable to their being or their existence. And these are stories, that kind of get uncovered slowly over time. So one of the approaches that I suggest for people to practice, to your most recent question, is saying, there's a part of me
Mhm.
that feels really affected when someone is telling me that I should do this instead of that. Or, there's a part of me that just gets really triggered because I feel like the message is that I'm not being good enough. And then you start to work with that part because other people aren't necessarily going to change. You could say,
Mhm.
"Hey, that wasn't really nice," or "Are you aware?" But most likely that's not going to help. But if you can actually kind of relate to that part of you, that kind of, oh, glommed on to perfectionism because it made so much sense back then when you were 12 years old. Oh, I'm just going to get straight A's and that will get me to college. And then,
Yeah.
is to kind of relate to that part of you and just recognize that you can now give yourself that encouragement and that acceptance that you might not have gotten
Mhm.
from the unaware adults,
Yeah.
in your life growing up, or the mean teacher, or that nasty coach, or, parents who might just not have been really, mindful or attuned, or, just thought that you were great no matter what you did anyway.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. Well, and then the other thing, another thing that I was wondering about, you were talking a few minutes ago about how, a lot of moms do. They feel this pressure to be doing everything, handling everything all the time, doing all the things. And then on top of that, a lot of times I know that they feel ashamed when they can't, right? Because again, it's expectation that we should be able to manage all of these things. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about shame and, how that ties into perfectionism.
yes, I would say that there's a good percentage of people who are perfectionistic that are really harboring some level of shame. And shame is one of those, I call it a sticky feeling. It's,
Mhm.
this sort of sense that you are bad or you are damaged in some way. There's something wrong with you. Not that you did something wrong, but there is something inherently flawed in you.
Mhm.
And it usually comes from an earlier childhood or adolescent experience or a series of experiences where you interpreted a situation, or maybe you have been told directly that there was something wrong with you and you internalized it. And that's what shame is. And shame is one of those things that it's kind of like the Brene Brown thing. Like, shame needs to actually be spoken out loud. It can't remain secret because that's what actually fuels more shame is keeping it
Mhm.
secret. And is it so interesting how people have a hard time naming it in the first place, and it's important to name it. It's actually important to name a whole variety of feelings, and a lot of perfectionists have actually shut down their feeling states, you
Mhm.
know,
Yep.
in
Yep.
the effort of just going, 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 like, I have no time to feel, I can't I don't even know how I feel, I just need to keep going, 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 or I feel exhausted. That might be the one one thing that they can relate to.
Yeah.
So you have to kinda start naming it, talking about it, identifying it, and then really applying self-compassion,
Mhm.
which I write a lot about and talk a lot about the importance of self-compassion.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. Well, and then, another thing that I know that you have talked about quite a bit is this idea of dropping perfectionism, but without dropping the excellence, right? And you were talking a little bit before about that line between the
Yeah.
two. And I'm wondering if we can just go back to that for a minute and if you can really, explain the difference between those two things, dropping perfectionism without dropping excellence.
Yeah, I think, perfectionism is on a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
And it's not like you can just get rid of it. Like, I feel like I can't really get rid of it in me. It's 30 to 40% in my DNA. Um, but and I get this question asked all the time because, when I'm doing sort of workshops or groups with people and, they come to the workshop because they say that they're a perfectionist and they're like, "Well, how do I know the difference? How do I know that my perfectionism has gotten me this far? If I don't have my perfectionism, then I won't actually progress. I won't be productive in life." And so I just challenge them. I say, "Listen, I want you to think about when you're striving for something or striving for a goal, are you feeling inspired, excited, full of life, joy, even if it's hard?
Mhm.
Or are you feeling tense? Are you overthinking? Are you, in negative emotional states? Do you find yourself stuck in procrastination? Look, kind check in, and that usually is, I think, the best litmus test. Like, if you're feeling inspired and motivated, and you have that energy, that's striving for excellence. If you are depleted and exhausted and you are just, pushing yourself to the wall, that's not healthy.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. Well, so again, just sort of when you talk about, having this self-awareness and checking in with yourself, sounds like just really sort of paying attention to, how you're being effective, right? At what point, because if we're feeling excited, if we're feeling joyful, if we're feeling motivated, we are probably going to be, much more successful than if we are, to the point where it is becoming problematic.
Yeah, I think one of the hard things, and I just know this, I can share a little bit of my story, how this was really highlighted in my life when I had a 2 and a 4-year-old. But we get stuck in that sort of stress loop, right?
Mhm.
And when we're stuck in that stress loop, it's really hard to jump out of it, in part because your body has adapted to a pretty high level of cortisol streaming through you. So many perfectionists feel like they can't slow down. And if they do slow down or rest, it feels so uncomfortable. It's this
Mhm.
really interesting paradox. And in part, it's because the body is saying, wait, where's this cortisol I need to keep moving and getting things done? And that's a tricky thing. So sometimes people have to withstand the withdrawal
Mhm.
from the high level of cortisol, right? That's why, like, a 1 week vacation never does it for a mom.
Mhm.
Ever, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you spend 2 days packing and then, to go, and then you spend the last 2 days packing to go back home. There's no rest. Our body actually needs more time to kind of rest, and that's pretty unrealistic for most moms. So we need to bake it in into our daily lives, and I do think that some of your other experts actually have spoken about this too, is like really breaking things down into, these pauses, these small moments. It's not like you're adding rest or meditation or journal writing to your list. You're actually incorporating it or habit stacking it in something you're already doing when you're having your cup of tea in the morning, when you're sitting in the carpool line waiting for your kid. You know what? Turn on that Calm app or whatever it is that you listen to. It's really important to keep pinging your nervous system that you know how to calm it down. So I often say we're working from the body level up versus the
Mhm.
top down because we try to muscle and think our way through things.
Mhm.
And that is taxing, actually. But if we can kind of step back and say, oh, right, no, actually have to teach my body that it's okay to relax and that when guilt arises or shame arises, that's just part of this withdrawal process because I'm not used to it.
Mhm. Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, so then for people who are, who are trying to, overcome perfectionism, they are trying to break free of it. What are some of the common mistakes that they make?
I have a hard time with mistakes. I think it's, again, like practice, Christy. Like, it's there's just a lot of trial and error here. And one of the things with perfectionists is they need to learn how to fail
Yeah.
and be okay with it. So it might take a number of rounds. It might take months to kind of get into a groove with, all right, my non-negotiable, and this is actually what I had to do, is my non-negotiable was I'm getting to yoga twice a week,
Mhm.
come hell or high water, because if
Yeah.
I don't find those 2 hours in an entire week, I'm gonna be a basket case. So what happened for me is when I was about, 35 and I had the toddlers, we're having, like, a Sunday barbecue in the backyard, and all of a sudden, I started just feeling this shooting pain on the right side of my face and down my arm, and I really thought, "Oh my god, I'm having a stroke. Like, what else could
Oh
this
my
be? I'm
goodness.
having
How
a
how
stroke. This is"
scary.
and I turned to my husband, I literally had, like, the barbecue utensils in my hand, and I was like, "Call 911," and I passed out. And so then my family is just watching me getting carted away, by the ambulance. And I get to the ER and they do all the tests. You're not having a stroke. You're fine, blah, blah, blah. But I'm like, what is this? And I still had this sort of tingling sensation. It was like a spider web was just thrown on my face. And they're like, "Oh, it's stress, it's this," and that's the worst thing a person wants to
Mhm.
hear, like, "Just
Mhm.
relax, you're taking a rest." And I was like, "No,
Mhm.
it's actually real." Like, the pain was real. I wasn't, I don't know, making it up, but it took
Right.
me saw a neurologist, and it wasn't until I got to a dentist's office, like, 6 months later that just said, I think you have trigeminal neuralgia," which is, sort of when the nerve by the ear just gets pinched, and I do grind my teeth. And so I thought, "Oh my god." It was this dentist. It was like sort of off the cuff statement. I was like, "That's it." And then I started doing the alternative and complementary medicines, like getting acupuncture and getting some chiropractic help. And that actually launched me into the whole mind body medicine space after that. Because it wasn't, it was really my body had accumulated this tension from all of this striving. I got my PhD and I was trying to work and I had these 2 little kids. And I don't know, the most exhausting time is when your kids are like under the age of 5.
Oh, yes.
Right? It is hard. It's really hard, and so
Mhm.
that was, like, my first wake-up call. I mean, of course, I didn't write about it until 20 years later, but that's the kind of thing that happens. It's like, "Well, how do you know?" Well, I knew I was striving. I knew that I had sort of perfectionism. It wasn't sort of in the foreground of my attention, but that physical situation really made me stop. I had to kinda do my own self-discovery on why was I having this chronic pain. And that's really kind of when the healing started, and that's when yoga became non-negotiable and, you know, "All right, well, do we pay for a babysitter or do I pay for acupuncture?" Well, okay, that's
Yeah.
a hard decision sometimes,
Mhm.
but that's kinda what happens, I think, for moms.
Well, okay, and so you mentioned a minute ago that, um, do you have a hard time really with this idea of mistakes? So then looking at it from the other direction, for any burned out moms who, again, they wanna try to break free of this perfectionism, what's a good place for them to start? What are some easy, simple things that they could do just to kind of, take that first step forward?
Yeah, so I teach a lot of, sort of body-based tools, really simple somatic exercises, um, breathing also, but I think it's important. to be able to do things actually with your eyes open. Like, moms don't have time to go sit on a cushion. I mean, if you can, I love it. That is so great. And I try to do that a couple times a week. Can't always
Mhm.
get to it. But as you're going about your day, to find these little transitional moments where you can do some kind of breathing pattern. So some people like box breathing or counting or really extending the exhale. I really like heart-focused breathing because it brings in the element of self-compassion, and there is research that shows that when you practice a self-compassionate gesture, like giving yourself a hug or putting a hand on the heart as you're breathing, and you do that consistently, it actually augments well-being for 20 or 30 seconds.
Wow.
That's
That's
it,
amazing.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Without the consistency, right?
Okay.
And
Mhm.
so when people say, "Oh, I couldn't get to exercise this week," and I'm like, "Yeah, but do you have 30 seconds? You have 30 seconds a couple times a day?"
Mhm.
Think about those times when you're doing the laundry. I had to reframe doing the laundry. It was the bane of my existence, actually, and thinking, "How can I get everything done, write grants, and do all this stuff, and there's all of this laundry?" And I was actually running a mind-body group for infertility patients, interestingly enough, and one woman said that I'll never forget this, it was so brilliant. She said, "The one time I can really relax in the week is when I'm folding the warm clothes from the dryer. I just hold it to my face and I take these deep breaths in." And I thought, "That is beautiful." And
Yeah. I love that.
and really reframed laundry for me, actually. As long as you can get the clothes when it's nice and dry and soothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Again, that is actually it's that sort of warmth, the warm towels, it's like, when you're at a massage, right? That actually releases oxytocin. It's we can recruit our own physiology to be on our side. There's 2 skills that I do that comes from, energy medicine, or actually I would say 3 that your listeners could easily do. So this comes from Eden Energy Medicine, and I absolutely love it. I call it the secret self hug.
Mhm.
And it's basically you're folding your arms in front of your body, and you have 2 fingers on the dimple above one elbow, right? So your opposite arm is holding one elbow, and then the other arm is holding the bottom ribs, and it's kinda like a smug hug. And you're holding actually 2 acupressure points that calm the nervous system. And you can do that for, like, 3 to 5 minutes. You can do that while you're watching TV or Netflix, is that you're just kind of tapping, you're just holding down on these acupressure points. That is super effective, and I do that, like, when students come in a panic, I just say, "Okay, I want you to hold this position on your arms, and let's just kind of, like, breathe for a minute, tell me what's going on," and usually, people calm down pretty quickly. The other kind of hug is it's a neurovascular hold, and I call it a brain hug, is where you put one hand over, the front of your forehead, like you're just kind of doing that, "Oh my god" position, but, you're putting your hand on your forehead and the other hand on the back of your head, sort of, like, level with where your eyes are, and you're just holding that position, again, for a minute or so, and what happens is it starts to bring blood back to your brain, it calms your breathing. And so I always laugh when I'm sitting with executives and we're doing the brain hug together, like sitting opposite each other. But people always say, it's like, "Okay, I can think clearly." Okay, so again, these little tiny things. And the other technique, and you're probably familiar with this as a therapist, is emotional freedom technique, tapping.
Mhm.
My clients love it. And I think the reason
Yeah.
why is that unlike sitting in sort of meditation or meditation posture, you're actually doing something with your hand. Your energy is actually going somewhere. So when you're tapping the side of your hand or the side of your eyes, or underneath the collarbone, it's actually giving you something to do while you're holding the paradox. Even though a part of me is being really nudgy right now, I know this is a phase, and I completely accept myself as I am right now, right? And so it it's just one of those, it's like a trifecta. It's like emotional exposure to what's difficult, so you're not denying what's difficult. You're tapping, down on the acupressure points that helps with that amygdala response in the brain, and you're actually saying an acceptance statement at the same time.
Mhm.
So I think
Mhm.
those kinds of little tiny things that you could do on the go, you could do in the car, you can do in the elevator, you can do in the bathroom at work, is super helpful, and you gotta just do them consistently. That's ultimately the
Well,
recipe.
and to your point, they don't take a lot of time, right? And that's
Right.
really one of the challenges for all of these working moms, right? Is one of the big barriers, to really prioritizing themselves is the lack of time or the belief in the lack of time, right?
Right.
And to your point, some of these things might take just a few minutes. Talk about some of these things taking 30 seconds. And
Yeah.
honestly, like if we take a step back, I mean, most people can find at least a couple minutes in their day. Even if they don't feel like they have an hour, like most people can at least find a couple minutes. So I really love, that you were able to share those. I think that those are going to be so helpful for the listeners. So I really, really appreciate that. Um, this is everything that you're saying today. Again, I think this has just been so, helpful. I think this is such a valuable topic to be talking about for these listeners because it is something that, again, I think so many people are struggling with. Um, where can people go if they want to learn more about you and your work? Where can they go to do that?
Okay, a couple places actually. Listeners can look up my book, The Perfectionist Dilemma. I have a book website associated. There's free, happy, cheaper tools on that. So it's perfectionistdilemma.com. Go to my website, which is my name, taracousineau.com. And this year, I started a really fun project on Substack called The Peaceful Perfectionist. So you can sign up for that newsletter for free. And every week I have a new article, and there's some of these tools on there and some little video clips. And yeah, so check those things out.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I will, of course, include all of that information in the show notes for people who want to look up Dr. Tara and learn more about this and learn more about perfectionism. So, before we wrap up for today, if you could leave the listeners with one final message, one final piece of advice, what would it be?
Oh my gosh, I think it would be to know that you deserve to be here, to redefine your worth, not by what you do or how well you do it, but by how present and kind and alive you feel while doing it.
Great, great. Well, thank you. And thank you so much for that. And again, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come talk to me. I really, really appreciate it. And as always, for the moms who are listening, if any of this resonates, if you found any of these things we talked about today be helpful, please feel free to look up Dr. Tara. Please share this podcast with any other moms that could maybe use some additional support because we are all in this together.